Financial crises do not begin with panic. They do not begin with people rushing to withdraw money, or markets collapsing overnight, or dramatic headlines announcing disaster. Those moments come later. By the time panic appears, the crisis has already been unfolding for years. What most people experience as the beginning is actually the final phase, when hidden pressures become impossible to ignore. This is why financial crises always seem sudden, even to experts. The warning signs were not invisible. They were simply quiet, technical, and easy to dismiss. This video explains how financial crises actually begin. Not with chaos. Not with bad decisions. But with small structural changes that slowly reshape the system from the inside. Financial systems rarely collapse when they look weak. They collapse when they look strong. This sounds counterintuitive, but it explains why crises repeatedly surprise people. Periods before major financial crises often feel calm, predictable, and stable. Growth may be slow, but steady. Markets may fluctuate, but within expected ranges. Institutions appear functional. Everyday life continues without disruption. This appearance of stability creates confidence. Confidence changes behavior. When people believe the system is stable, they adapt to that belief. Businesses expand cautiously but continuously. Households take on manageable levels of debt. Governments assume growth will continue. Financial institutions optimize for efficiency. None of these actions are reckless. They are rational responses to an environment that appears safe. But this is where the problem begins. Stability does not remove risk. It rearranges it. During long periods without crisis, systems become optimized for normal conditions. Buffers are reduced. Margins shrink. Redundancies are removed. What remains is a system that works extremely well, as long as nothing unexpected happens. The longer stability lasts, the more behavior adapts to it. Risk becomes harder to imagine. This is not denial. It is learning. People learn from recent experience, not distant history. When disruptions do not occur for a long time, the system begins to treat stability as the default state. This assumption shapes decision-making at every level. Debt feels safer because refinancing has always worked. Liquidity feels reliable because markets have always functioned. Institutions feel resilient because they have never failed. The system begins to rely on continuity. This reliance is subtle. Nothing breaks. Nothing fails. But flexibility quietly declines. Another important feature of this phase is delayed consequences. Many financial decisions do not produce immediate outcomes. Debt can be rolled over. Losses can be deferred. Risks can be spread across time. This creates a gap between action and consequence. As long as outcomes remain positive, behavior does not change. The system appears healthy, even as underlying pressure grows. This is how vulnerability builds without awareness. Another illusion created by stability is the belief that risk is controlled. Modern financial systems use models, metrics, and regulations to manage risk. These tools work well when conditions resemble the past. But they are less effective during structural change. When incentives shift, when behavior changes, when systems evolve, models lag reality. Risk is still present, but it is no longer measured accurately. This creates a dangerous mismatch. People believe risk is lower than it actually is. Confidence increases. Exposure increases. Sensitivity increases. All while indicators suggest everything is fine. Another aspect of the illusion of stability is fragmentation. Stress does not appear everywhere at once. It appears in specific places. A housing market slows. A sector struggles. A region experiences pressure. These signals are often dismissed as isolated issues. They are explained away as temporary or local. This interpretation prevents systemic awareness. Because crises are expected to be widespread and dramatic. quiet, uneven stress does not match the mental image of danger. Another illusion is created by intervention. When problems arise, authorities often act to stabilize outcomes. This can be effective. It can also delay adjustment. Interventions reduce short-term pain. They also reduce the information carried by pain. Without pain, behavior does not change. The system continues operating under outdated assumptions. Over time, intervention becomes part of the system. Participants expect it. This expectation further increases risk tolerance. The illusion of stability deepens. Another reason stability is misleading is that financial systems are adaptive. They change in response to rules, incentives, and behavior. When conditions remain favorable, adaptations accumulate. These adaptations are not coordinated. Each actor optimizes locally. Collectively, the system drifts. This drift is not obvious. There is no single moment when stability turns into fragility. The transition happens gradually. Only visible in hindsight. Another illusion comes from narratives. Narratives explain why things are working. They provide coherence. As long as the narrative remains intact, contradictory signals are ignored. Weak data is framed as noise. Rising debt is framed as manageable. Asset inflation is framed as confidence. Narratives are powerful. They coordinate expectations. They also delay recognition. Another factor is memory. People remember recent outcomes more clearly than distant ones. Past crises fade from relevance. Lessons soften. Warnings feel abstract. This makes repetition likely. Not because people forget, but because conditions feel different. Each period of stability feels unique. Finally, stability hides thresholds. Systems can absorb stress up to a point. Beyond that point, behavior changes abruptly. But thresholds are invisible until crossed. This makes stability deceptive. Everything looks fine until it is not. This is why financial crises do not announce themselves. They emerge from systems that appear stable, functional, and under control. The illusion of stability is not a mistake. It is a natural consequence of how complex systems operate. And it is always the first stage of a financial crisis. Once stability becomes the default assumption, the financial system begins to tolerate small imbalances. These imbalances do not appear dangerous at first. They are gradual. They are distributed. They feel manageable. This is why they are allowed to persist. One of the most common imbalances is the slow increase in leverage. Leverage grows not because of recklessness, but because it works. Borrowing allows growth without immediate sacrifice. It smooths volatility. It improves short-term outcomes. As long as conditions remain favorable, leverage appears harmless. The problem is not leverage itself. The problem is dependence on it. When systems rely on borrowing to maintain normal function, flexibility disappears. Any disruption becomes more consequential. Another imbalance appears in asset prices. During long periods of stability, asset values tend to rise faster than underlying productivity. This is often explained as confidence or optimism. Rising prices reinforce belief in the system. They create a feedback loop. Higher prices attract capital. Capital inflows push prices higher. Rising prices validate earlier decisions. This loop continues quietly. But it changes the system's structure. When asset prices carry expectations of continued growth, stability becomes conditional. The system now depends on prices not falling. Another imbalance forms through timing mismatches. Many financial arrangements involve short-term obligations backed by long-term assets. As long as refinancing remains available, this mismatch is invisible. Cash flows appear stable. Payments are made. Nothing breaks. But the system becomes sensitive to timing. If refinancing conditions change, pressure appears immediately. This vulnerability accumulates unnoticed. Another imbalance emerges in institutional behavior. During stable periods, institutions optimize. They reduce costs. They streamline operations. They minimize idle resources. This increases efficiency. It also reduces resilience. Buffers shrink. Margins narrow. Redundancy is removed. Each step improves performance metrics. Each step reduces tolerance for stress. Another imbalance comes from regulatory adaptation. Rules evolve in response to past crises. Over time, these rules become integrated into behavior. Institutions learn how to operate efficiently within them. This compliance is not malicious. It is adaptive. But it creates blind spots. Risks that fall outside regulatory focus receive less attention. Behavior shifts toward what is measured. Unmeasured risk grows quietly. Another imbalance appears in expectations. When stability persists, expectations become anchored. People expect tomorrow to resemble today. This expectation shapes contracts, planning, and investment. Unexpected outcomes become less likely in models. This reduces perceived risk. But reality does not adjust to expectations. The gap widens silently. Another imbalance comes from unequal stress distribution. Not everyone feels pressure at the same time. Some sectors struggle early. Others benefit longer. This uneven experience prevents collective recognition. Those under stress adapt quietly. Those still benefiting see no reason for concern. The system appears balanced from the aggregate view. But internally, strain accumulates. Another imbalance arises from intervention reliance. When systems are stabilized repeatedly, participants adjust behavior. They assume support will be provided again. This assumption reduces caution. Risk tolerance increases. The system becomes dependent on intervention. This dependency is not visible until support becomes constrained. Another imbalance comes from complexity. As systems grow more complex, understanding declines. Participants rely on abstractions. Models replace intuition. Trust shifts from direct observation to indirect signals. This reduces sensitivity to early warning signs. When complexity masks risk, imbalances persist longer. Another imbalance forms in liquidity perception. Liquidity is assumed to be continuous. If markets have always been liquid, they are expected to remain so. But liquidity is conditional. It exists only when participants are willing to trade. During stress, willingness changes. Liquidity evaporates unevenly. This shift is sudden, but its conditions are built gradually. Another imbalance is behavioral inertia. People prefer continuity. They adjust slowly. They delay uncomfortable changes. This inertia allows imbalances to grow. Because adjusting early feels unnecessary. Adjusting late feels unavoidable. Another imbalance arises from narrative reinforcement. Narratives explain why current conditions make sense. They evolve to justify outcomes. As long as narratives hold, contradictory data is discounted. This reinforces existing behavior. The system drifts further from balance. Another imbalance comes from delayed accountability. When decisions do not produce immediate consequences, responsibility blurs. Outcomes are attributed to external factors. This reduces learning. Behavior does not adjust. The imbalance grows. Another imbalance is the erosion of shared understanding. As systems become specialized, participants understand smaller parts. No one sees the whole. This fragmentation prevents early recognition. Warnings feel incomplete. Signals feel inconclusive. Action is postponed. Another imbalance forms through optimism bias. People believe negative outcomes are unlikely. This bias is reinforced by stability. Each year without crisis strengthens belief.
This belief shapes risk assessment. Risk is discounted. Exposure increases. Another imbalance is created by gradual normalization. Practices that would have felt risky earlier become standard. Boundaries shift. What once required justification becomes routine. This normalization hides accumulation. Another imbalance comes from structural rigidity. As systems optimize, they lose adaptability.
Change becomes costly.
Resistance increases.
When adjustment is delayed, correction becomes larger.
Another imbalance arises from interdependence. Systems become tightly coupled.
Failure in one area affects others.
This coupling is efficient. It is also dangerous.
Small disturbances propagate. But this risk is hidden during calm periods.
Another imbalance forms through delayed feedback loops. Actions influence outcomes with lag.
By the time effects are visible, behavior is entrenched.
Correction is difficult. Another imbalance is the illusion of diversification. Risk appears spread. In reality, it may be concentrated. Correlation increases during stress. This correlation is invisible during stability. Another imbalance comes from time horizon mismatch. Short-term incentives dominate. Long-term risk accumulates. This mismatch persists because rewards are immediate. Costs are deferred. Another imbalance is institutional memory loss. As personnel change, experience fades. Lessons weaken. Warnings lose authority. History becomes abstract.
This makes repetition more likely.
Each of these imbalances is small. None are alarming on their own.
Together, they reshape the system. They create a structure that appears stable but is increasingly sensitive.
The crisis does not begin when something breaks.
It begins when these imbalances reach a level where adjustment can no longer be gradual.
By the time recognition arrives, accumulation is complete.
The most dangerous phase of a financial crisis is not when people panic. It is when people continue behaving normally inside a system that has already changed.
At this stage, nothing feels obviously wrong. Markets still function. Institutions still operate. Daily transactions continue. But the system is no longer forgiving. Actions that were safe before now carry unintended consequences. This is the moment when normal behavior starts causing damage. One of the first signs is sensitivity. Small disturbances produce outsized reactions.
A minor policy change affects markets significantly. A modest slowdown triggers sharp adjustments. A limited disruption spreads quickly.
Earlier, the system absorbed similar events without issue. Now, it reacts. This change is subtle. Participants often attribute reactions to temporary factors. They assume volatility, not vulnerability. But sensitivity is structural. It indicates that buffers are thin. Another sign is the reversal of cause and effect. During stable periods, behavior shapes outcomes. During crisis formation, outcomes begin shaping behavior.
Falling confidence changes decisions.
Tightening conditions alter plans. Expectations adjust defensively. This feedback loop accelerates stress. Behavior reinforces deterioration. Another critical change is the emergence of forced actions. Margin requirements are triggered. Covenants are breached. Liquidity thresholds are crossed. These mechanisms are automatic.
They do not wait for judgment.
They enforce adjustment abruptly.
Participants are compelled to act regardless of context.
This creates sudden shifts.
But these shifts are not the beginning.
They are the release of accumulated pressure. Another sign is coordination loss.
Earlier, participants shared expectations.
They assumed others would behave predictably.
As conditions tighten, this assumption weakens.
Trust erodes.
Participants become cautious not only about outcomes, but about other participants' actions. This uncertainty slows transactions.
Liquidity declines further. The system becomes brittle. Another indicator is institutional hesitation. Authorities become cautious. Language changes. Commitments become conditional. Decisions are delayed. This hesitation is often misinterpreted as indecision. In reality, it reflects constraint.
Options that were effective earlier now carry higher risk.
Intervention becomes more complex.
This hesitation signals that the system is operating near its limits.
Another sign is the concentration of stress. Problems stop appearing isolated. Multiple areas experience pressure simultaneously. Credit markets tighten. Asset prices stall. Economic activity slows. This simultaneity matters. It indicates systemic involvement. But because each issue still appears manageable, recognition is delayed. Another change is the distortion of incentives. Survival replaces optimization. Participants prioritize liquidity over efficiency. Safety over return.
This shift affects pricing.
Assets once valued for yield are reassessed for risk. This repricing feels sudden, but it reflects accumulated reassessment. Another sign is the breakdown of narratives. Stories that explain stability lose credibility. Explanations feel forced. Contradictions grow. People sense inconsistency. But clarity does not arrive immediately. Confusion increases.
This confusion delays coordinated response.
Another important shift is time compression.
Decisions that were planned over months must be made in days.
Deadlines accelerate. Pressure increases. This compression amplifies errors. It reduces reflection. The system moves faster than understanding. Another indicator is selective failure. Not everything breaks at once. Some institutions fail early.
Others survive longer.
This uneven failure creates false reassurance. Observers assume the problem is contained. In reality, failure reveals vulnerability.
Another sign is liquidity illusion collapse. Assets assumed to be liquid become difficult to sell.
Spreads widen. Depth disappears. This transition feels abrupt.
But liquidity conditions were deteriorating earlier.
Another change is the amplification of feedback loops. Actions taken to reduce risk increase risk elsewhere.
Selling depresses prices.
Price declines trigger more selling.
These loops accelerate decline.
Once dominant, they are difficult to stop. Another sign is psychological shift. Confidence flips to caution. Optimism becomes defensiveness. This flip is rapid. It feels sudden.
But it reflects long-standing doubt reaching a threshold.
Another indicator is structural exposure. Hidden interconnections become visible. Losses propagate. Contagion appears.
These connections existed earlier.
They were simply inactive. Stress activates them. Another sign is loss of optionality. Choices narrow. Paths close. Flexibility disappears. Participants feel trapped.
This sensation defines crisis experience.
Another shift is the reframing of risk. Risk is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate. This reframing alters behavior permanently. Even if stability returns, behavior does not fully revert.
Another sign is the recognition gap. Some understand the situation earlier.
Others lag. This uneven understanding creates misalignment. Actions conflict. Coordination fails. Another indicator is normalization of emergency measures. Actions once considered extraordinary become routine. This normalization signals deep change. Another shift is the abandonment of long-term planning. Focus narrows to immediate survival.
This shortens horizons.
It reduces investment. It slows recovery. Another sign is emotional detachment. Participants stop reacting emotionally. They act mechanically. This detachment is not calm. It is exhaustion. Another indicator is institutional fatigue. Repeated stabilization attempts lose effectiveness. Trust erodes. Confidence weakens. Another shift is the loss of narrative authority. Experts disagree publicly. Consensus breaks. This uncertainty magnifies stress.
Another sign is the perception of inevitability.
Participants feel outcomes are beyond control. This belief accelerates adjustment. Another shift is the realization of limits. Limits to growth. Limits to intervention. Limits to control. This realization is sobering.
Another indicator is the disappearance of denial.
Reality becomes unavoidable.
At this point, the crisis is visible.
But it did not begin here. This phase is when accumulated imbalances interact with constraint.
Normal behavior becomes harmful because the system context has changed.
People are not behaving irrationally. They are behaving according to old assumptions in a new environment. This mismatch defines the escalation phase of a financial crisis. The system no longer absorbs stress. It transmits it. This is the point of no return.
When a financial crisis finally becomes visible, it often feels instantaneous.
Markets fall quickly. Institutions fail within days. Confidence disappears almost overnight. This creates the impression that something broke suddenly. But what actually happened is different. The system reached a point where gradual adjustment was no longer possible.
Financial systems can tolerate stress only up to a threshold. Below the threshold, pressure is absorbed, delayed, or redistributed. Above it, behavior changes abruptly. This threshold is not visible in advance. It is discovered only by crossing it. This is why crises appear unpredictable. The collapse phase is not the beginning of the crisis. It is the moment when accumulated imbalances are released all at once.
One reason collapse looks sudden is nonlinear response.
For a long time, additional stress produces little visible effect. Then a similar amount of stress produces a disproportionately large reaction.
This is not randomness.
It is a structural feature of complex systems.
Another reason is delayed recognition. Many participants adjust quietly before collapse. They reduce exposure. They increase liquidity. They become defensive. These actions are not public. They do not appear in headlines. When recognition becomes widespread, adjustment happens simultaneously. What felt gradual internally appears sudden externally. Another factor is coordination. Crises accelerate when expectations align. Once enough participants believe conditions are deteriorating, behavior synchronizes. Selling increases. Lending contracts. Spending slows. This synchronization amplifies movement. The system shifts from dispersed adjustment to collective response. Another reason collapse feels abrupt is confidence dynamics. Confidence does not fade evenly. It holds until it breaks. As long as confidence persists, systems function despite strain.
When it breaks, behavior changes decisively. This creates sharp transitions.
Another factor is institutional constraint. When collapse becomes visible, options are limited. Interventions that might have worked earlier are less effective. Responses feel reactive rather than preventive. This reinforces the perception of sudden failure.
In reality, the window for smooth adjustment closed earlier.
Another reason is narrative lag. Narratives explain stability.
They persist longer than conditions justify.
When narratives fail, orientation collapses. People struggle to understand what changed. The answer is uncomfortable.
The system changed gradually.
Perception changed suddenly. Another contributor is media focus. Media attention concentrates during visible disruption. Earlier signals receive little coverage. Later events dominate. This skews perception.
The public experiences the crisis when it becomes newsworthy, not when it becomes inevitable.
Another reason collapse feels sudden is personal experience. Stress affects people at different times. Some feel it early.
Others feel it later.
When stress becomes widespread, it feels collective and abrupt.
But many have been adapting quietly for a long time.
Another factor is memory bias.
People remember crashes more vividly than build-ups. They recall outcomes, not processes.
This reinforces the belief that crises appear without warning. Another reason is causal complexity.
Crises rarely have a single cause. They emerge from interaction.
This makes early explanation difficult. Without clear causation, warnings feel speculative. People wait for confirmation. Confirmation arrives too late. Another contributor is institutional messaging.
Authorities often emphasize stability to prevent panic.
This delays recognition. When messaging shifts, the contrast feels dramatic. Another reason collapse feels abrupt is threshold behavior. Systems resist change until limits are reached.
Beyond those limits, change accelerates. This is a phase shift, not a linear adjustment.
Another factor is rigidity. As systems optimize, they lose flexibility. Small adjustments become difficult.
Large adjustments become inevitable.
Another reason is illusion of control.
As long as systems function, participants believe risk is managed.
When control fails, the contrast is stark. Another contributor is backward-looking visibility.
We identify crises after collapse.
We label beginnings retroactively. This creates a distorted timeline.
The true beginning is earlier.
The visible beginning is late. Understanding this gap changes interpretation. Financial crises do not begin with collapse. They begin with quiet shifts in structure, incentives, and behavior. They feel sudden because recognition lags reality. By the time collapse becomes visible, the process is already complete. This is how financial crises actually begin. Financial crises rarely begin with collapse.
They begin much earlier, when systems slowly change in ways that feel reasonable, safe, and even beneficial at the time. By the time markets fall or institutions fail, the most important shifts have already taken place. Incentives have changed. Buffers have thinned. Normal behavior has started producing unintended consequences. What feels sudden is usually the moment when reality becomes impossible to ignore. Understanding how financial crises actually begin does not make them easy to predict. But it does make them easier to recognize in hindsight, and easier to understand without panic or confusion. This channel focuses on calm, clear explanations of how money, power, and economic systems really work beneath the headlines. If this kind of long-form documentary analysis is useful to you, consider subscribing. New videos are released regularly, each exploring one hidden mechanism shaping the global economy. Thank you for watching.